Good morning. Welcome to the Ethical Humanist Society of Chicago. My name is Svetlana Beckman. I will be your moderator. I want to welcome our wonderful audience in the building, and I'm really thrilled to see as many people as I do. And we also welcome our YouTube audience. After our speaker concludes his remarks, there will be an opportunity to ask questions, and I will tell you more about that. Let me just start by saying a few words about humanism. Humanism is a life philosophy that is guided by reason, inspired by compassion, and informed by experience. It encourages us to live well and fully. It evolved through the ages and continues to develop through the efforts of thoughtful people who recognize that values and ideas, however carefully wrought, are subject to change as our knowledge and understanding advance. And so I hope that today's program serves that purpose as well. And on to today's program. We here on Sunday mornings address a wide variety of topics, including current events, philosophy, arts, and the sciences, to name just a few. Today's presentation is part of our ongoing programming on culture and society. Our speaker today is Eric Zorn. Eric was an opinion columnist for the Chicago Tribune from the fall of 1986 until the spring of 2021, covering news, culture, sports, and just about anything else that was on his mind. He started the paper's first blog and was a podcasting pioneer. He's currently a weekly panelist on the Mincing Rascals, an award-winning podcast produced at WGN Radio, and the editor and publisher of the Picayune Sentinel, an independent email newsletter on the Substack platform. Eric is a return guest, having spoken to us several times in the past, and we are very pleased to welcome him back to talk about the perils of public discourse. Welcome, Eric.
Thanks. Good to see people out. I'm going to frame my talk today around a personal story that will sound very familiar to those of you who've been following the decaying of our society's capacity for rational discourse. On September 26th of this year, the DePaulia, the student newspaper at DePaul University, published an opinion essay by two of the paper's news editors declaring that it was, quote, inappropriate that I had been invited to participate in the upcoming campus panel discussion called Tough Times for Local Journalism. Their reason was that I had, quote, expressed racist views about Latinx youth and shown great insensitivity toward police brutality in a column that was published in the Chicago Tribune nearly 6 months earlier. They wrote, quote, selecting Zorn to speak at DePaul shows students of color that the school has no regard for their physical or mental well-being. We believe that hate speech should not be allowed on campus because it can put students at risk of vulnerable situations. Now, I want to litigate this accusation because I think it's illustrative and important. The column that riled up these two editors, and I admit literally thousands of people on Twitter at the time, was about the police killing of a 13-year-old boy, Adam Toledo, in Chicago's Little Village neighborhood. It happened at 2:38 in the morning, Monday, March 29th. Police had responded to reports of gunshots fired. They chased Adam, who was carrying a gun, down an alley, and they killed him with one shot to the chest. That's what we knew at the time that I wrote the column, a little more than a week after this fact. It was, I wrote, a tragedy no matter what the circumstances were. A lot has gone wrong when a 13-year-old ends up fleeing from police in the middle of the night with a gun in his hand. But was it an outrage? Another example of unjustified police violence against people of color? Activists had already decided that yes, it was. They were marching in the streets in protest. Black Lives Matter of Chicago tweeted, "There's absolutely no justification for murdering our children." Organized Communities Against Deportation tweeted out a drawing of Adam with angel wings and a halo over his head, accompanied by a statement reading, "There are no instances where murderous violence against a child is justified." And I want to emphasize that this was before any body cam video had been released showing the circumstances of what police were describing as an armed confrontation that resulted in the boy's death. Now, I believe that it is the sacred duty of not just a newspaper columnist, but of a citizen to take a step back when emotions are high like this and say, wait a second, what do we know to be true here, and what do we just think might be true? Before we convict a police officer of murder in the court of public opinion, shouldn't we apply the same tests of fairness and make the same demands for evidence that we would if we ourselves were to be accused of a crime? That's what I wrote. That was the racist hate speech that editors at the DePaulia said threatened the physical and mental well-being of students of color at the university, and it disqualified me from being part of a panel discussing the future of local journalism. I didn't once mention race in that column, though Adam was Hispanic and that was well known by then. What I said was, it was too soon to declare that he was a martyr to police violence. I wrote, activists and concerned community members are right to keep the heat on for answers. The public deserves them after any police shooting of a civilian. And the activists may be right that the officer fired without justification and that Adam Toledo is a martyr whose killer should be prosecuted. Or a thorough review may find that the officer shot in justifiable self-defense. It's too early, I wrote, it's too early to say. That seemed obvious to me, and it still does. I went on to point out that a big reason this case was getting so much attention, both locally and nationally, was the boy's age. He's just 13. He was a baby, said a tweet from a local anti-violence activist. Well, I wrote that while it's too early to jump to conclusions about this particular shooting, it is not too early to stop romanticizing and infantilizing 13-year-olds. They can be dangerous. I cited 5 examples of 13-year-olds charged with murder in the US in the previous 6 months. I wrote that these 5 cases don't necessarily tell us anything about Adam Toledo, but they do suggest that using his age as shorthand for innocence and harmlessness in this situation, and as proof of the depravity of the police officer, generates heat, but it sheds no light. A 13-year-old with a gun is as dangerous as a 23-year-old or a 33-year-old with a gun, maybe even more dangerous, given what we know about the lack of judgment and impulse control in adolescence. In fact, I wrote that it's the very lack of judgment in still developing brains that inspires the hope for growth, reform, and redemption that undergirds the concept of juvenile justice. It's what renders immoral the idea of imposing life sentences on young offenders. I concluded by arguing that it's not too early to ask how we can better support young people, all people, in economically disadvantaged communities, to ask what employment, educational, and recreational opportunities we can offer them to give them better paths to success and safety, to ask what treatments and interventions will reduce the number of such shattering incidents in our communities. Well, I was buried on social media for this. I received literally thousands of incandescently angry, contemptuous responses to this column before I turned off my mentions. The central allegation was that I was defending the murder of a child, almost certainly because that child was not white. I was then, I remain today, willing to discuss this allegation with anyone who is willing to listen as well as shout at me. I extended a particular invitation, one that remains open, to Northwestern University journalism professor Stephen Thrasher, who tweeted that he was canceling his Tribune subscription over my column because, quote, there is no space in a newspaper for arguing for the murder of a child, that it's never too early to think that they are worthy of murder. That's a journalism professor at Northwestern University. I wrote to Thrasher a month later with a calm invitation to discuss his accusation against me. I wrote to him, one of the jobs of a journalist is to question and challenge emerging narratives and conventional wisdom, to be clear about what we know for sure and what we just suspect. Here was his response to me in full quote, your words make the murder of children more likely. I have no interest in you, your unethical nature, your cynical worldview, or in communicating with you, period, unquote. That's a journalism professor at Northwestern University. After I published this exchange in the Tribune, his colleagues at the university rushed to publicly distance themselves from his remarks and his attitudes and to defend me. I'm just kidding. Of course they didn't. They said nothing. I heard crickets from the vaunted Medill School of Journalism. Do his colleagues there side with him? I don't know. I doubt it. I believe nearly all of them do agree that one of the jobs of a journalist is to question and challenge the emerging narratives and conventional wisdom, to be clear about what we know for sure and what we just suspect. Are they scared for their professional lives that if they speak up, speak out against this activist bullshit, that they too will be buried on social media? That inflamed students will call them racists and try to deny them the opportunity to have a voice on campus? I don't know. I don't speak cricket. But I'll consider this speech a public invitation to the leadership at Medill to clarify their position, take a stand. Not just about me, but about the fundamental idea that we should not, must not shy from challenging emerging narratives and conventional wisdom. Our culture has to relearn how to debate and discuss difficult issues without taking every disagreement straight to 11 and trying to stifle and silence those who take an opposing position. College campuses have become hotbeds of this. Insufferable, self-righteous activists continually attempt to deplatform and shame those with whom they have basic policy differences. Take the case of Dorian Abbott, distinguished geophysicist at the University of Chicago. The Massachusetts Institute of Technology invited him to give a public lecture this fall about his work in the area of climate change. Then all hell broke loose because Abbott, who is white, is an opponent of affirmative action measures designed to advance the diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives at academic institutions. He and an accounting professor at Stanford wrote an opinion essay in Newsweek in August that said this, quote, "Diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts violate the ethical and legal principles of equal treatment. They entail treating people as members of a group rather than as individuals, repeating the mistake that made possible some atrocities in the 20th century. DEI measures compromise the university's mission. The core business of the university is the search for truth. The university's intellectual environment depends fundamentally on its commitment to hiring the most talented and best trained minds. Any departure," he wrote, "from this commitment must come at the expense of academic excellence and ultimately will comprise the university's contribution to society," unquote. Now, whether you agree or disagree with Professor Abbott's take on racial preferences or in hiring and admission is not the point. The point is that his is, in fact, a debatable proposition, a proposition that is, at the very least, in the mainstream of American thought. 2018 survey from the National Opinion Research Center at the University of Chicago found that 72% of US adults oppose giving preference to Black Americans in hiring and promotion. A 2019 Pew Research Center survey found that 73% of Americans say colleges and universities should not consider race or ethnicity when making admissions decisions. Last November, California voters defeated 56-44, a proposal that would have allowed race and gender considerations to be a factor in public employment, education, and contracting. Earlier this year, when Gallup asked vaguely about affirmative action programs, however, they found 62% support. But no matter how you analyze the data or how you ask the question, you simply cannot deny that affirmative action is an issue about which reasonable people do disagree. MIT was having none of it. The university canceled Abbott's lecture in the face of complaints similar to those he'd received at UChicago, that his very presence threatened the, quote, "safety and belonging of all unrepresented groups." Now, the mention of physical safety has become familiar. You'll remember that the DePaul students who felt I should not grace a stage there fretted that my very presence amounted to hate speech that might, quote, "put students at risk of vulnerable situations." Could actual hate speech put certain individuals in danger? Of course. But categorizing mainstream ideas or opinions with which one does not agree as hate speech puts the entire concept of rational discourse in, what would they call it? A vulnerable situation. Rational discourse is how we settle differences, edge toward compromise, devise ways of living together in a society in which we inevitably have different opinions about important things. Political orthodoxy, political fundamentalism says that either you are 100% with us or you're a heretic, and that's toxic to the functioning of a free society. Do you have any questions or misgivings about when and whether trans women, those people who are born male and transition to female, can compete in women's sports or be housed in women's prisons or admitted to women's domestic violence shelters and so on? If so, you're a hater. Even if you're otherwise totally fine with respecting gender identity and using preferred pronouns and you're in favor of equal rights and housing and unemployment, if you're not all the way there, you're transphobic. Even though you're not alone, Gallup poll in May found 62% of respondents saying transgender individuals should have to compete with and against athletes of their, quote, birth gender. Now, pretending this view is not even debatable is, in fact, the extreme position, the position that should be marginalized. When I was mocked and reviled for my Adam Toledo column, it was unpleasant. I admit it. I lost some sleep over it, primarily because I was out of town at the time. And I was a little worried that some of these inflamed critics would literally bring their protest to my doorstep. Protesting at people's homes has become a thing, a deplorable thing, in my view, but a thing. The boundaries between public and private are crumbling. Consider the protesters who followed Arizona Senator Kristen Sinema into a public bathroom on October 2nd to confront her over her obstructionist policies. Well, I lost sleep that week, but I didn't lose my job. My editor stood beside me despite turmoil in the newsroom from my colleagues who had turned on me. Not everyone who was dogpiled on Twitter is so lucky. Earlier this year, I wrote about Dr. Howard Bachner, editor of the Journal of the American Medical Association here in Chicago. He was forced to resign because, and see if you can follow this, the host of a JAMA podcast that Bachner was not on offered on that podcast the opinion that poorer health outcomes for African Americans are, quote, more of a socioeconomic phenomenon, unquote, than evidence of structural racism in society. Now, this view is heterodox, not just controversial, but heretical in the eyes of some. The podcast host was forced to resign his position at the magazine. And then Bachner, groveling obsequiously about his ultimate responsibility and muling that he was profoundly disappointed in himself, was nevertheless also shown the door. Consider this local story. In early June 2020, a little more than a week after George Floyd was murdered by Minneapolis police, and many cities were roiling with protests over racism and police violence, the Chicago-based Poetry Foundation put out a statement. And I will read it to you in full because it is short and you want to hear the whole thing. The Poetry Foundation and Poetry Magazine stand in solidarity with the Black community and denounce injustice and systemic racism. As an organization, we recognize that there is much work to be done, and we are committed to engaging in this work to eradicate institutional racism. We acknowledge that real change takes time and dedication, and we are committed to making this a priority. We believe in the strength and power of poetry to uplift in times of despair and to empower and amplify the voices of this time, this moment, unquote, full statement. Got it? Can you see the problem with this? The offense that prompted some 1,800 outraged people to sign an open letter demanding the resignations of Foundation President Henry Beenan and Board of Directors Chair Willard Bunn III? Well, friends, that statement was, quote, worse than the bare minimum, unquote, because, quote, given the stakes which equate to no less than genocide against Black people, the watery vagaries of this statement are ultimately a violence, unquote. Now, in this over-the-top condemnation was what I consider to be a reasonable demand for the Poetry Foundation to write a meaningful statement that details the specific material ways in which it plans to work on eradicating institutional racism. What are the tangible actions that the Poetry Foundation will take towards supporting these racial justice initiatives? Fair question. The initial statement from the Poetry Foundation was light on details, and it would certainly be reasonable for concerned parties to request a follow-up containing specifics, but that's not how we're doing things anymore. Aggrieved parties take things to 11. You don't say, okay, good start, pretty words, but let's put some action behind those words. No, you say this lack of specificity is a violent contribution to genocide. The authors must be fired. You don't say, this podcast raises some interesting questions about the degree to which the persistent racial inequalities seem linked to poor health outcomes from African Americans. No, you say all involved must be fired for daring to suggest that socioeconomic factors may play a larger role than racism in poor health outcomes. You don't say affirmative action requires some policy trade-offs that many people consider a violation of the right of every individual to equal treatment. You don't say that. You don't say, let's discuss how we can best promote equity and inclusion given that reality. No, you say a person with such a view cannot be allowed to speak. And to my story, you don't say, We would like to discuss the most effective ways for reporters and opinion writers to cover controversies that arise over incidents in which the outcome is tragic for persons of color, but the details are still very unclear. No, you say all reporting and commentary that doesn't conform to the party line, that cops are violent racists who want to murder Black and brown children, are heretical. You say that those who have another view pose a literal threat, tantamount to an act of violence to others, and must be shunned from polite society. You say, as another journalist in town wrote, that it, quote, doesn't matter a lick what happened before the officer shot Adam Toledo, because, quote, this isn't a both sides issue. There's only one side here. Only one side. You got that? Even though on the ground reporting in the aftermath of that incident showed that residents of Little Village were divided about the circumstances of that shooting. Even though I got email from hundreds of supportive readers, including John Rosales, former member of the board of directors of the Little Village Chamber of Commerce, saying that they shared my view. Even though by that time the police body cam had been released. It showed that Adam had discreetly tossed his gun behind a fence in a split second before he wheeled around with his empty hands up, creating a situation in which the officer was not in danger, but perceived that he was. It was unnecessary. It was a tragic mistake. But so far, it has not been treated as a crime, much less a murder. It turns out it does matter a lot more than a lick what happened before the officer made his fatal miscalculation. But there's only one side that's allowed to have a view. Many of my critics thought I should have lost my job over that column, even though I did write a follow-up in which I expressed regret for the chilly and analytical tone, a tone that didn't really convey how awful it was that that kid had lost his life. Those howling for my head didn't know that I've championed liberal causes for decades. My first big story about the flaws of the death penalty was a lengthy investigation that cleared 2 Hispanic men in a 1983 rape and murder of a child, and it implicated a white defendant who was later tried and convicted for that crime. I'd also written columns demanding a review of the so-called Ford Heights Four, a quartet of African-American men wrongfully convicted of a 1978 double murder of a white couple, and of Juan Rivera, Hispanic man, wrongfully convicted of the 1992 rape and murder of an 11-year-old white babysitter in Waukegan. The mob does not do nuance. The mob does not accept apologies, clarifications, or invitations to dialogue. The mob, like Northwestern University journalism professor Stephen Thrasher, does not want to debate. The mob wants to cancel people. I realize that cancel culture is a divisive term and one that's been embraced by the right. My fellow lefties say, no, it's not cancel culture, it's accountability culture, it's consequence culture. They say that efforts by the extremely online to have people deplatformed and fired are simply efforts to hold people accountable and to endure consequences for their horrible words. Well, that's nonsense. The desired consequences are vastly disproportional to the perceived offenses, and they are usually administered without any kind of objective, rational evaluation of the situation. It turns out that mobs are uniquely bad at that. But what's also nonsense is the idea that the left is where all the canceling and attempted canceling takes place. Long before cancel culture was even a term, the political right has been enthusiastic in its attempts to ban, burn, and marginalize books, music, activists, and anything or anyone else they feel has stepped over some cultural or political line. You want cancel culture, try the McCarthy-era blacklist, try the Moral Majority founder Jerry Falwell's 1999 effort to take the Teletubbies off public TV because he thought Tinky Winky was gay. Try the 2003 country radio boycott of the band then known as the Dixie Chicks for criticizing President George W. Bush. Try the efforts of conservatives to ban from the curriculum such books as Catcher in the Rye, Grapes of Wrath, Slaughterhouse-Five, the Harry Potter novels, and Beloved, to name just a few. Try the efforts of former President Donald Trump to get fired Bill Maher, Chris Matthews, Katie Tur, Paul Krugman, Chuck Todd, Kathleen Sebelius, Donna Brazile, and others. Try Trump's futile calls for boycotts of companies he felt had crossed him or insufficiently respected him, including Apple, Harley-Davidson, Nabisco, Rolling Stone Magazine, Univision, and Macy's. Think of the calls he led in 2017 for San Francisco 49ers quarterback Colin Kaepernick to be fired or suspended for kneeling during the national anthem to protest political violence against Black people, and think of how the NFL responded eagerly to that call. Or just take a look at the demands of the right these days that teachers not be allowed to dwell on America's ugly history with race, but instead be forced to inculcate students with something called, quote, patriotic history that glosses over the unsavory elements in our collective past and promotes shallow jingoism. Members of school boards across this country have been subjected to harassment and threats for not towing the conservative line on the teaching of race or on the imposition of mask mandates. In suburban St. Charles recently, school board members received emails saying, quote, your days are numbered. They were compared to Nazis on social media, and one found dead animals in her driveway. The indignation, the vitriol, the bitter accusations, and the threats do, yes, sometimes cause people to be fired, lose their jobs, prompt them to resign. Other people simply lose income opportunities. But the main point of all this organized obloquy from the far left and the far right is not to harm the reputation or job prospects of individuals. Many of their victims are just fine. J.K. Rowling, who has been roundly and persistently criticized for not being fully on board with the trans agenda, will always have more money than God. She'll have a huge audience for whatever she writes. Same with comedian Dave Chappelle. He'll be fine. So will Professor Abbott at the University of Chicago and those associated with the Medical Journal and Poetry Foundation. So will I chose not to participate in the Tough Times for Local Journalism panel out of respect for my former colleagues and friends on the panel who are volunteering to give up a weeknight and deserve not to have the panel derailed by some ridiculous protest. Instead, I told my story to close to 20,000 online readers of the Picayune Sentinel, my weekly publication at ericzorn.substack.com. But I suspect they don't really care. Their main goal was never to silence me. Now, their main goal, the main purpose of most similar forms of attempted cancellation is to strike fear into the hearts of those who have opinions, reasonable, thoughtful, even majority opinions that cut against groupthink, but people who are comparatively powerless, who don't have tenure, or supportive supervisors, or bank accounts that can sustain them through periods where they are deemed too controversial to employ. The main point is to intimidate them into silence. What are ordinary students at DePaul supposed to think when their campus newspaper rages that someone who offered an opinion that strayed from the view that we should not wait for evidence to convict a Chicago police officer of murder in the court of public opinion, that person ought to have no right to speak on any subject at the university? What are students at Northwestern University supposed to think when one of their journalism professors proudly cancels his subscription to the city's main newspaper in a tantrum, in which he says that an opinion that does not match up to his own is tantamount to endorsing the gratuitous killing of children? And nobody on the faculty says, no, that's not how journalism works. I'll tell you what they probably think. They probably think, if I have different views from my most earnest and socially conscious classmates on this or other issues, I'd be wise to shut the hell up because I'll be next. And that is cancellation, not the attempted muzzling or browbeating or shaming of one person, but the climate of fear that's created and silences dozens, scores, hundreds of people whose names and stories you will never hear, who tells everyone thinking about running for a school board that their lives could easily be made hell if they win. Consider just one more local story. The story last week about McDonald's CEO Chris Kempczynski, whose private text to Mayor Lori Lightfoot recently surfaced in an FOIA request. He mentions the shooting deaths of two young Chicagoans, Adam Toledo and 7-year-old Jocelyn Adams, who was collateral damage in an attempted gang hit at a West Side McDonald's. And in this private text, he said to the mayor, quote, "The parents failed those kids," which I know is something you can't say, unquote. Well, activists branded him as an ignorant racist, and he squeaked out an apology for not having shown empathy and compassion in a text, meant for one person. Somehow, typing with his thumbs, not even using proper punctuation, he neglected to fully contextualize the comprehensive social pathologies that parents must battle in disadvantaged communities. And therefore, he blasted over a blunt opinion without any nuance behind it. And the angry opportunist jumped on it as though this were a fully fleshed out position paper that reflected his views and his corporation's views. Well, those of you who have never dashed off a thought in private communication or conversation that would make you look bad if it was reprinted in the papers should feel free to get up on your high horse and wag your finger at Mr. Kaczynski. The rest of us should try to have that difficult and even at times painful conversation about the undeniable role of parental influences on the young, good and bad, and how we might improve them, how we might help parents on the front end instead of blaming them on the back end. A difficult conversation without recrimination, without shaming, without piling on, without loaded accusations, without name calling. The title of this talk is The Perils of Public Discourse. And I hope I haven't disappointed you by not listing more examples of people who have experienced that peril directly, not just on college campuses, but also at publications, at corporations, at public schools, and town halls. We don't have a week. We don't even have all day. In conclusion, if you're among those who think there is only one side that gets to safely express opinions on important, controversial issues, then you and I differ. If you don't see that this issue, like so many others I've touched on today, are legitimately debatable, issues that people of goodwill should be able to discuss in a spirit of intellectual inquiry, then you are part of the problem. You're part of the reason that public discourse has become increasingly perilous. You're part of the reason that our society is so polarized right now, so unable to find common ground, so willing to see politics as a zero-sum game. But if you're not afraid of debate, of hearing and engaging with views that differ from your own, then you should speak out. You see the intolerant forces of cancellation agitating or threatening or trying to silence not just those who have spoken, but those who might someday speak. Write to newspapers, magazines, journals, administrators, get on social media yourself and say enough, enough. Speaking of enough, that's enough for me today. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, Eric. We will now have a brief musical interlude to be followed by Q&A. We invite you to make contributions at our website. A link will be posted in the YouTube chat. And those of you who are here in person can scan a QR code that is posted in various places. There's one behind you, or pop a few dollar bills in a box that is right by the back door there. We suggest a donation of $5. It is through our generosity that we show how meaningful the Sunday morning programs are. Any amount that you're comfortable with is greatly appreciated. And thank you to all who sustain the society with volunteer efforts and money. And I will describe the Q&A process in a few minutes. Thank you. Q&A. So those of you who are in the audience, there's a microphone right there. Please feel free to get up and ask a question. Please try to make it succinct so that we're respectful of other people who may have questions. And then after fielding maybe 2 or 3 in the audience, I will be looking at my phone where my colleague is transmitting all of the very many questions that are coming in through YouTube chat. So keep entering those and we'll answer as many as possible. If we have anyone who would like to ask a question in person.
Hey, Eric, thanks so much for being here with us this morning. I'm about your age, and I'm also white, and I'm also really lucky in sort of almost all of my life circumstances. And as I imagine, you probably feel like you are too. And I personally have spent the last year and a half thinking a lot about how I have benefited from institutional racism, and what does that mean about how I comport myself moving forward? How do I use my time and energy? I don't have a platform of any kind. I have like 5 Instagram followers and I don't post there. But so I think there's not just, I have the right to say what I want to say, but I feel a big burden and responsibility to think about and reflect on how I've been advantaged through all of my 6 decades. And how do I step back from that and share the resources I have, whatever voice I do have, whatever power I have, how do I make room for those people who I have been happily ignoring their lack of voice and their lack of power, and not just assert that I still have a voice?
That makes sense to me. I'm sure that most people in this room feel like they were blessed in some or many, many ways when they were young and when they're through their educational opportunities and through the lives they've had. It makes sense to me that you would think about what you can do politically and socially to counter the kinds of things that you feel are iniquitous in society. I totally agree with that.
Hi, thank you for your talk. About 2 or 3 years ago, Jeffrey Stone was here, and he had written a book about, essentially it was about censorship on college campuses. And I wondered if you had any comments about censorship on college campuses and whether you considered any of it justified.
Is any of it justified? I mean, I suppose that some of it probably is. I don't know of all the instances that Stone has written about or talks about. There's certainly, you don't want to have, give someone who's a white supremacist a lecture series and things like that. But I think what Stone is talking about, and what I'm certainly talking about, is like people who are in the mainstream of American political thought who are denied opportunities to speak on college campuses. I mean, you also see like that Hannah Nicole Jones was denied an opportunity to speak. I think it was in Maine recently. Or was it Maine? I can't remember where now. I'm gonna mess up the institution where it was, but where she was considered too toxic to speak at a certain event. So it's not just on one side or the other. But in general, I think that college campuses should be places where a lot of ideas are boldly explored and where free debate can occur without anybody feeling physically threatened or feeling professionally threatened. So I would feel that there are probably very, very limited times where I feel like people should be denied an opportunity to speak to an audience. I wrote about another thing at DePaul a few years ago, where a guy, Milo Yiannopoulos, who's basically a provocateur on the right, the campus Republicans had invited him to speak. And to his fellow campus Republicans in a meeting room at DePaul, and the activists decided the best thing to do would be to show up there and blow whistles and go up on stage and refuse to let him talk. I don't think that he is so far out of the mainstream of American thought that you would say that he cannot speak. I would think that you can certainly counter his speech, but I think that preventing anyone from speaking is a really dangerous road to go down. Because he may feel like, well, this is a great thing to do because I disagree with him so strongly. But imagine if and when that shoe is on the other foot, when your opinions can't be voiced at certain institutions. when people you support are being silenced. So I tend to be much more wide open about that than most college campuses are these days.
Thanks for your perspective. It was very helpful to hear it, and it was very informative. A question I have is, what's the antidote? We certainly have heard a lot about the sort of big cases, or there's some very well publicized situations, but every day there's circumstances you come into where it's very difficult to know what is the appropriate way to have differences of opinion, sometimes substantive different opinions that are very meaningful for people, but to engage in a constructive discourse. What would you say is something as an approach that we can begin to take, regardless of where we are on any particular issue, to have some sort of ground rules or have some sort of process of having constructive discourse?
Well, I would think that you could have programs, even say like this one here, forums like this one, where you would have people with different points of view on topics get up and have a respectful exchange. You certainly have, are certainly programs online. There are debate programs, counterpoint style programs, where one side will speak, the other side will speak. They'll try to win over an audience and so on. To my mind, the idea of putting people into dialogue, into public dialogue, that is in an atmosphere where you can say what you're thinking and not be shouted down, is certainly one great step. It's something that I've always thought is a really good step. And it's one reason why I never engage on Twitter in Twitter fights, because people are just there performing. They're just spouting off, and they don't really want to have a conversation. In 256 characters, they don't want to have a conversation. They just want to call names and run away. I don't think that helps. I think you could have a conversation in a setting like this, in front of people who are listening and engaging on just about any topic, where someone could say, look, just for example, this issue that the professor at University of Chicago raised about diversity, equity, and inclusion measures. How do you balance those goals with the rights of individuals to be judged as individuals? How do you do that? I think you could have a respectful conversation about that. I don't think you can say, if you don't have my view, then I'm not going to hear you out. I don't think that gets people anywhere. So I would think that forums and public debates is the way to go.
There's lots of really good questions. So, I'm going to try to combine a few. So a critique of your position is, it's always the powerful who, will use the language of slow down, be civil, wait for stable change. And really, the powerless don't have that luxury, right? One might say, and they have to push very, very hard and fight with all tools at their disposal. And sort of a follow-up, the mob that wants to cancel, isn't that arguably the same mob that wants that wants access to reproductive health or wanted access to gay marriage? So you got to break some eggs. My critique might be to make an omelet.
I don't necessarily believe that it's true you have to break eggs to make an omelet. I don't think you have to say someone who say might have been opposed to gay marriage at what time needed to have lost his or her job over that, or someone who opposes abortion rights needs to lose his or her job. I think you need to argue with and make your point productively in public spaces. I think that the idea that, well, the only opportunity we have, the only avenue we have to object to this is this mob culture. Dr. Stephen Thrasher at Northwestern University is not an unempowered person. He's someone who could have easily engaged with me in a dialogue about this particular column. He chose not to. He chose just to call me names and run away. So I don't have a lot of patience for that particular argument. Certainly there are people who are dispossessed, unempowered, but I think they can demand debate. They can demand forums, and I don't think that there's any question that they could have such forums. But the idea that you have to go after individuals and you have to silence other points of view, I don't think that there's any historical justification for that. I think that kind of change that we're looking to make requires buy-in. And what I hear when people hear these stories about the Poetry Foundation, about the AMA, about MIT, in my own story, that they are not drawn toward that point of view that is trying to silence others. They are drawn to the point of view that says enough of this already. You push them into not supporting your position. I think while you are also silencing people who may want to speak and may be afraid to speak, you are also, as I've said before, in some ways you're minting Trump supporters when you do that. You're pushing people away. And that's happening in our culture because people don't know how to approach this idea of debate. So
let's see. I'm just trying to sort of combine some of the questions. It's payback time, one might say. What would you say about the people who did lose their jobs for hundreds of years because of advocacy for gay marriage? I think what the speaker is suggesting that it's sort of like time to turn the tables.
People lost their jobs because they
advocated or because they were gay, or people, marginalized minorities, right?
Oh.
In the past were persecuted, and I don't know. I'm reading this question as basically like it's payback time.
Okay. Well, I don't think that wins the argument. I don't think that advances the cause. You can say, like, we're going to go out and we're going to take away your job, your right to speak, or we're going to try to shame you now because people previously have been shamed. If it was wrong then, it's wrong now. And even if you're just giving vent to your anger, it's still extremely unproductive. It doesn't bring people over to your cause. People are not won over by this kind of insistence, and I think we've seen some of that in some of the election results around the country, where you've got an electorate that's fairly moderate but is open to ideas in most cases, but is feeling themselves pushed away by statements that are being made from people who are deciding that this is a time to get payback on them. And I just don't think that that's a politically wise position to take.
Another question has to do with the polls that you've cited, various research that reflects public opinion. But would you agree that just because a view is popular and held by a majority, it's not necessarily moral or good for society?
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. I definitely agree with the fact that because a view is popular doesn't mean that it is right or correct in any sense at all. And you look historically at polls, and the polls, and we go back to gay marriage. Gay marriage polled terribly for a long time, and over time now it polls pretty darn well. But I don't think that the polling suggests that which is the correct position necessarily. What I'm saying is that when you have an issue that's like 60-30 or something like that, or 66-33, something, when you've got a position that is mainstream. So we're not talking about denying Nazis the right to speak. We're not talking about people who are just completely in this crazy edge of society. We're talking about people with mainstream opinions and popular opinions, and you can't beat those opinions. You can't beat them down by saying we're not going to let you speak. That's a terrible way to win a public argument. It's the way to lose a public argument. It's the way to push people away, and that's what I mean. So yeah. I think that the answer to people who were opposed to gay marriage 20 years ago, when the Republicans were all running on this and winning elections on it, the answer was not to say, you can't speak, you can't give voice to that point of view. The answer is, here are the reasons, A, B, C, D, why this is the moral position, why this is the position that our society ought to take. And I took that position myself, and I got hate mail for it, but nobody ever said, I never once thought, boy, the people in the moral majority, they should not be allowed to speak because they have a different view of mine. That is a really radical position to take. And so what I use the polls for is just to suggest that we're not talking about silencing extremists. We're talking about silencing people who have mainstream views, people who need to be won over if you're going to win the political argument and make political progress, which is what we need to do.
Thank you so much for your talk. I was wondering if you could compare a little bit the US versus other countries currently, just in terms of where you see the sort of cancel culture style debate.
I don't know. I haven't paid that much attention to situations like this in other countries. I mean, I certainly know that ideally and realistically, we're far freer here than we are, say, in China to express contrary opinions. But as far as like Western Europe and places like that, I mean, any place that's under a dictatorship is obviously there's no freedom of speech for those with opposing positions. So I guess I'd say I don't know the answer to that question.
Hello. I'm wondering if you might have any insight in whether there's any larger root causes toward creating this problem, or is this a symptom of a larger issue of like increased isolation in our society today? Is it something else? Is it increased secularization? Just wondering what your thoughts are on that.
My only thought on that is that it I think has something to do with the development of social media, of the ways platforms like Twitter encourage people to pile on to people. That sort of is this consequence-free ability to essentially throw rocks at people you disagree with. And so when you have that, and again, I really like most of what social media has to offer. I'm not a huge critic of Facebook or Twitter in general, but it does offer that ability to have people who I can identify together with a certain point of view to all get together and sort of make themselves feel like they're all right and the other person they're opposed to is all wrong. So it frees up that ability for people just to do this, to engage in these things where you wouldn't have had that. I don't think before Twitter you wouldn't have had it. You certainly wouldn't have had it 20, 30 years ago. And of course, back then there were I think arguably too many gatekeepers in media, where too many points of view were not allowed to be expressed, where you did not the kind of cancellation was going on in the booking rooms and so on, where people didn't have platforms. So people with potentially marginal points of view, but who wanted to get them out there, we had to rely on mimeograph machines and handing out leaflets on street corners and tacking up notices on bulletin boards. So I do feel like social media has played a role in both good and bad in creating the kind of conditions that we see. Sorry.
You've talked a lot about the ability and the right, I suppose, of the speaker to speak, but can you speak to the necessity for the hearer to hear? I mean, those of us who don't have a strong opinion on a particular topic, right, it's really critical for us to be able to hear different points of view so we can form an opinion. So could you just address that aspect of this controversy, just the controversy about discourse?
Well, no one should force anyone to listen to anybody, that's for sure. I mean, if you're in a situation where you're forced Clockwork Orange style to take in somebody's opinions. But I mean, I think it's incumbent on people to read other opinions, to look to other sources for, if you want to effectively counter an argument. I'll go back to the affirmative action question. If you want to effectively counter an argument against affirmative action, you actually have to understand that argument. And it's one of these sort of, I guess it's a law school position where they make you argue the other side. They say, what's the best argument for the other side, and how do you counter it? Do you understand where this other side is coming from, and can you counter that, rather than saying that comes from a bad person, I don't have to listen to it, I don't have to engage it, because I don't think you make any progress in that sense.
So here's I guess a two-part conversation. A reader is referencing your now infamous, well, there was a comma, you wrote a column, I guess, and it was commentary on Hurricane Katrina. And I understand from the question that you said that Black residents were looting and white residents finding food. Can you understand the perspective of your critics who see a similar bias in your column when you offer examples of 13-year-olds who commit violent crimes as a justification for fearing Adam Toledo?
A couple of points. One is that I think the column that the person is referring to about Hurricane Katrina is not one that I wrote. It was a column that was in the Tribune, but it was not by me. So I'm not exactly sure why that got looped into there. So the question had to do with, do I understand? I'm not saying in that column I didn't say you need to fear someone like Adam Toledo. I'm saying that to say he was 13, therefore he was harmless, therefore this is murder is a logical syllogism that just doesn't work. And so to make that case, I said, oh, look, 13-year-olds get charged with murder. There are 5 of them in the last 6 months. I'm not saying, and I was very clear to add, this says nothing about this individual case. It's just to say, let's not start using these symbolic ways of saying that somebody is therefore innocent of what's going on, that we therefore know more about what happened because of this kid's age. Does that answer that question? Because I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think I misunderstood. I think I misread. I think what the questioner wrote was like your column, comma, like your current column, comma, the now infamous photos captions. So he's juxtaposing those, the analogy. Right, that your column in citing examples of 13-year-olds, you know what, I think you've addressed it very nicely. All right, this is just amazing. Speaking of, this is discourse, people, right? This is good. Okay, sorry, there was a really good one. Surely there are questions that don't merit anyone's time. The earth is round. Can part of this, what's going on, be viewed as moving the line on what is accepted and therefore no longer merits other sidism? Could it be that when people's lives, trans and people of color, hang in the balance, maybe that impatience is warranted?
I would say certainly impatience is warranted in terms of extending rights. And I've always been a champion of extending rights to people and extending the concept of justice to people. The question seems to be, do we, by saying that there is some debate about whether trans girls can play in girls' sports in high school, whether acknowledging that is a legitimate debate is a point that is so out there that it can't even be discussed. Does that move the line? Does that help move the line? And so is it just a tactical decision? I don't know that it is even thought of as a tactical decision. It may in retrospect turn out to be one, but certainly you end up risking alienating people who you want to bring into your cause. Just as a purely tactical matter, I don't think that it's necessarily smart to say, you may have some qualms about bathroom issues, locker room issues, sports issues. You may be 90% of the way there with us, but if you're not 100% of the way there with us, you're a TERF, you're a transphobe, you can't speak. I don't think that's a way to win converts. That's my experience looking at 40 years of covering political matters in this city, in this region, in this country. I don't think that that's a way to win arguments.
But I think the question is, I think the questioner is saying it is as well established that whatever, fill in the blank, as the fact that the earth is round. I think the questioner is trying to make an analogy between extremely well-established scientific and other facts and some of these cultural issues. And they're saying, look, we've settled that the earth is round. We're not going to debate that. Similarly, we really shouldn't be debating any longer that trans women can play sports with other women. That's the analogy here. And
right, I don't think that analogy holds. Even no matter what you believe in that, you can't. I don't think you can say that belief is. You can pretend that it is. You can say, well, society believes that trans girls should be able to play girl sports as much as they believe the earth is flat. That's not true, and I don't think that helps the conversation to say that this is a point of view that is so out there that it is equivalent to flat earthism. I don't understand. I mean, I think the analogy just fails. Maybe it'll be that way someday. I mean, I've said before that I think that some of the opinions that some of the most conservative Republican politicians in this country have would have been considered radically liberal 150 years ago. No question about it. Most conservative Republicans think that women should be allowed to vote now. Most of them think that equal rights for African Americans and women are obvious, manifestly obvious, and that would have been a radical position a long time ago. So that window does move, but it doesn't move by saying that it's not a debate when it still is a debate.
I just had a follow-up of what you were just talking about, which is the metric then just popular opinion, and the sort of merits of the argument are irrelevant? As in, if there's something, if 30% of the population thought the earth was flat, would that then be something we don't want to silence as an opinion? And if in 100 years, nobody thinks that, or, gay marriage is something that only a tiny fringe believe in, then we can silence those voices on, say, college campuses?
Well, be a nice world if you had a time, just hardly anybody thinking that gay marriage was something that should be banned. I wish that were the case, and I think we're getting there. I really do. I think that the public opinion on gay rights and on gay marriage has shifted dramatically and favorably with incredible rapidity in this country, which is a great thing. But I don't think that any of that progress was made by telling people they can't express a view. I think a lot of that progress was made by effective debating and countering of viewpoints, and it isn't made by and to get to your other point, if 30% of the people thought that the earth was flat, and I'm thinking that there's a decent analogy with that, and the percentage of people who think that the vaccine has got some sort of terrible qualities, that it's tracking you, or that it hurts your fertility, or that it's a plot by big pharma, and all the nutty reasons that people have avoiding the vaccine. I don't think you can say you can't speak those. I don't think you can say you can't give the answer to those points of view is not to say shut up. The answer is to talk to those people and to try and to show them and prove to them that they're wrong, rather than telling them you're wrong, you don't have a right to say that. So I would say that that's a relatively decent analogy.
Just on that particular point, you're right at a one-to-one level, but literally these social media platforms are not letting people put that crap on social media, because it does matter. It's not neutral to let people say that the anti-vaccine stuff in those amplified places, and Twitter and Facebook and whatever all of them are explicitly not letting that happen. And I'm personally, as a health guy, really grateful. So I think that's a little bit of an important footnote there.
Yeah, that's a whole different topic. Of what should or could be allowed on social media, and how you're going to counter what's being said on Fox News. I mean, they're keeping it off Facebook, but they're not keeping it off Fox News. Yeah. So I don't know what, if you're just nursing a sense of grievance on people's parts. And of course, Facebook is a private institution. So,
well, that's actually my question is, do you think traditional journalism is going to come back ever, where it's like, and define it however you want. I think you criticized it a little bit because, certain fringe items you said couldn't, we're never going to get into the paper. But I do think there's a benefit to having a New York Times with a sort of viewpoint maybe, but not like too much. It should still be news. And the Wall Street Journal, that's going to say something a little bit different, and they can maybe have a little debate. But at least those journalists are real journalists who have spent years and years doing it, and not just some random person putting something up with the sort of given somehow the same sort of authority. Do you think traditional journalism in that way will ever come back?
I don't think it's gone. And I think that you have places like the op-ed pages of the Times and the Wall Street Journal and the Tribune, certainly, where various points of views are expressed, but not every point of view, not every person with a nutty view is allowed onto that platform. So I think that is still there. And I think the most of what you see in the New York Times, most of what you see in the Tribune, Sun Times, Wall Street Journal, in their news pages is good journalism. And I think that helps form the bedrock for the sorts of debates that we're talking about. So I don't think it's gone. And I think that it can play a really constructive role in mediating these kind of disputes and talking about these things. And when you have an issue that is legitimately controversial, to have forums, platforms, pages and papers that present both sides and lets the reader say, okay, these are both points of view. Which one do I agree with? And think about in your own life, how have you changed your mind in your life? When you have had an issue that you change your mind on, and maybe it's the death penalty, maybe it's gay marriage, maybe it's religion. Is it because someone just came up and told you you were wrong, you should shut up? I don't think so. I think it's because you have read and considered points of view and go like, you know what, that kind of makes sense to me. Maybe I should rethink my position on that. I think that's how you change hearts and minds. I don't think you change hearts and minds by denying people an opportunity to express themselves and shaming them when they do.
So in terms of, changing one's mind, in the past year, I have learned a lot about how important it is to listen to long suppressed voices without talking. Have you found new places to listen to and learn from new voices? And have you, I'm adding this for myself, and have you, as a consequence, changed your mind about an issue, perhaps?
In the last year? No, not really.
This person is speaking about in the past year, perhaps referring to the murder of George Floyd. I'm not sure, but just in general, have you been seeking out, I guess, long suppressed voices? I think is probably referring to racial and sexual minorities. I'm not sure, but
Sure.
Have you been reaching out to hear to new voices, and have you, as a result? I guess new voices would be not white males, right? Have you, and have you changed your mind? I mean, again, I'm just reading you.
Well, it takes a lot to change somebody's mind, but in terms of deepening one's thinking, I think that always takes place. That when you're reading from a variety of different sources, you hear what people have to say, you consider their arguments. I read all the time, so I do listen to a lot of different voices, and I think it's deepened my understanding of a lot of these issues. And when I'm challenged on these things, when people are interested in talking to me about certain issues, if people want to talk to me about, the very, very few people who have wanted to reach out to me and discuss some of these issues without just being howlingly angry about it, I'm more than happy to listen to you. I'm more than happy to engage in conversations with people about the different ways that we see the same sorts of issues. That is definitely, I've learned a lot about other people's points of view, how they come to them. And in some cases, it's strengthened my views. I would say that in my life, in my journalistic life, I was marginally or mildly in favor of the death penalty until I started listening to some conservative arguments against the death penalty. I'm liberal, but I remember the one that really hit me the most was Charles Krauthammer, who was a pretty well-known conservative. And I didn't have much of a thought about the death penalty. I read Krauthammer's column on it, and he made the case that I came to embrace, which is that it's a terrible policy. And to realize that Charles Krauthammer was to my left on an issue made me really think hard about where I might want to be on that. And it changed my thinking. It began the process of changing my thinking. I think it's very difficult to change someone's mind with one essay or one thought, but I think that the idea is to deepen people's understanding of the other side, what they see, what they think, and when you do understand that, it helps you. Like I said, it deepens your thinking, and it makes you open, ultimately, in the long run, to perhaps fully changing your mind. I mean, I actually think that we talk about the trans issue. I think that the acceptance of trans people and trans rights has been heartening and dramatic and very rapid. Actually, if you think about the course of society and how people like that, how trans people were regarded not that long ago, and how, for the most part, now the mainstream position is generally accepting of that. Certainly, in my milieu, it's not like this is something that was very unfamiliar to people, very unusual. People were getting their minds around it for a while, but that it took time, and it did not take mockery and shaming to get people to move their feelings about that to a place that I think is healthy. So.
I know this is supposed to be a question, but it's a quick comment. I think dialogues are good for us for two reasons. One, I could be wrong. And the other reason is I learn how better to present my arguments.
So here's a question. Could you comment on the research that suggests that actually an emotional tie to the issue is more likely to change an individual's mind rather than a rational argument backed up with data? And wouldn't that counter your previous supposition? I guess the supposition being that engaging, yeah, I'm not entirely sure, but I guess what do you think about that an emotional tie to the issue is more likely to change an individual's mind? Like, for example, much of the acceptance, I think, of gay equality came from gay people coming out and straight people realizing that the people they actually love and have relationships with are gay, and therefore it is that caused them to embrace equality rather than an abstract argument about,
I think it's true. I think that when you do know gay people and when you realize they are people that you have known and you have loved and so on, that it opens you up to the vacuity of the arguments and the feelings that you had before. I don't think that logic is necessarily just divorces. I don't know about the studies they're talking about emotional resonance, but I do know that we are certainly tribal in this country, and that a lot of times your point of view about something is based not necessarily on your own self-interest or your own economic situation or your own social situation. It's involved in your peer group's feelings. So you have communities of people who are supporting Donald Trump, whose policies were not at all helpful to their particular economic class, but whose nerves were being jangled by some of his appeals to people like that. So yeah, I mean, it isn't all rational, but to the extent that the belief is that we can shame you into changing your mind, I don't know that there's research that suggests that that's a smart tactic. That you can say, well, or we can threaten you, and essentially when you're talking about this kind of massive shaming, it is a threat. When you have someone, just think of the Poetry Foundation people. I mean, I read their entire statement. It was a little bit anodyne, I suppose, but it hit the right notes for 3 paragraphs, I thought. And you've got people who are going to be afraid to say that they're afraid to be platitudinously supportive of Black Lives Matter because it's not going to be enough, and and so that makes them shut up, and it makes them angry. And I don't think that that's a smart way to advance a cause. Obviously, a lot of people differ because obviously a lot of people think this is the best way to do it is to shut people up. I don't.
Encouraging public discourse from all sides without standards seems to invite extremists to define positions outside of the mainstream to move the ball. Ken Ham, Milo Yiannopoulos come to mind. Is that fair? I guess, shouldn't there be some guardrails? You can't have all sides. You have to have some guardrails. Maybe this is back to the earth is flat.
For what sort of forum? I mean, if
it says public discourse. So let's say opinions in the newspaper.
Opinions in the newspaper. An editor at the New York Times opinion section lost his job because he published an op-ed by Tom Cotton, I think it was. The idea that if we say that people who have maybe even minority views, but certainly common views, need to be silenced because we have decided that view is incorrect, is really what I'm talking about here. I'm not talking about giving flat earthers a platform. So I'm not sure exactly what the question is involved, but I do think that if you're talking about campuses, if you're talking about newspapers, you're talking about, there is a range of opinion that reflects that it's not freakishly out there, that discusses issues from various points of view. I think it's important to have those voices and to have those voices in in contrast with one another, in dialogue with one another, rather than to say, we're not going to hear from this other side because this other side is, I think someone said earlier, the other side has had its turn over the years to speak. Well, that doesn't mean that they're going to go away just because you're going to say, shame on you, you should lose your job. I think you need to engage people. You need to meet people where they are, as they say.
This is a bit snarky, I think, but I'll ask it anyway. I'm
Snarky?
curious if the speaker has perspective of men, perhaps specifically white men, experiencing public critique is now, so your experience is now bringing you closer to the experience of women colleagues in prior years.
Well, I don't know that, I can't think of women colleagues in prior years who've lost their jobs over.
Well, just being pilloried on social media, being called names.
Yeah,
being threatened with.
But I'm not sure that was a gendered problem, just given the recency of social media. I don't know exactly what the exactly what they're talking about, but I think what the question is sort of getting at is this based on the fact that certain like majoritarian points of view are no longer permitted, and that I'm realizing that because it happened to me? Yes, and in fact that is definitely true. I mean, I'm telling my story because it resonated with me quite strongly. But does that mean that I was ignoring things like that were happening before? And I'm open to that suggestion, but I can't think of examples where we could go to that column that was talking about the Hurricane Katrina, which was written by a woman, and I came to the defense of her over that column. I thought that she was unfairly pilloried for that. And I'm guessing that's not what the person is getting at here, but I'd be open to anyone who wants to suggest that there are examples that I simply ignored because of my white male privilege.
Yeah, I mean, I think the question is, it's like, okay, now white men who've always been at the top of the heap are finally getting pushback. I mean, I'm channeling, I don't know, like,
right.
And do you have now some, I don't know, now you're feeling what everybody, not you personally.
I don't mind pushback. I wrote a column for, since 1986, I got pushback all the time from people. I got criticized all the time. I think this is a different kind of phenomenon here. And again, if you can point me to examples of women or minorities who were hounded, who were denied a chance to speak at a college campus, or who were fired from a publication. Pardon?
They just weren't invited.
Well, okay, but that's not the same thing as telling someone.
Wait,
Well,
come
no.
up and ask.
No, it's not. It's not the same. The fact that someone wasn't invited, I mean, you can point to some examples of that, but I don't think we're talking about the same phenomenon at all. I don't deny the existence of sexism. No one would. No one would deny the existence of racism. The idea that suddenly having a point of view is something that pushes you off the table of polite society and onto the floor. That's the phenomenon we're talking about. And if I have ignored that happening to women and minorities, someone literally losing their job for speaking out, offering an opinion that is a mainstream opinion, I'm open to hearing about that. I just don't. I can't think of things like that. But
here's a question that is in magnitude. Would you say public opinion stifles editorial power? Oops. Sorry. Questions are coming in fast and furious. Okay, so there's the phenomenon the questioner identifies as public opinion stifles editorial power versus we do not have diverse representations in editorial decisions. I mean, I think the questioner is asking, how do you weigh the problem of public opinion stifling editorial power versus editorial staff not being sufficiently diverse? I don't know, in terms of race, in terms of opinion. Not sure what is.
I think it's important for any publication that aspires to presenting all sides, both sides of major issues to present diverse points of view. I think that's really important. I'm not exactly sure what
Do you
they're.
think that you need different identities? You need people
Yes.
from different racial,
Yes.
ethnic,
Yes.
socioeconomic groups represented in those decision makers in order to represent, in order to articulate the different opinions.
Yes, of course. I think it's definitely when you have publications that, like I say, aspire to presenting a range of views, that searching out diversity of what I would call reasonable views, and I don't mean by that things that I agree with, but I think views that are within the mainstream. Does that mean that really radical points of view shouldn't be allowed on the, if they're well argued and provocative enough? Yeah, they should be allowed in there. But you should, any publication that aspires to that sort of balance absolutely should have diversity of socioeconomic, racial, gender, gender identity status, all those sort of things. Those views should be definitely included, because you want to help the public help make up its mind on some of these issues. I mean, to me, that's the important thing, is like, let's look at the points of view, let's look at these arguments, let's weigh them. And I think that allowing diverse populations to have a voice is really important. And I feel like our publications are getting better at that. And they have a ways to go, obviously, but our newsrooms have a ways to go. And perhaps our cable television outlets have a ways to go. But I think that those are excellent goals. Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, I noticed that I'm probably, I'm just at the right time, and I want to thank you once again, Eric. Thank you for stimulating such a great conversation.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
My little cheat sheet. Again, I want to thank Eric for a really stimulating, lively discussion. I'm sorry to all the YouTube questioners. I was not able to get to all of your questions, and I probably misstated some of them. I was just trying to combine and rephrase, and so I did the best that I could. And so I will end with by inviting you, of course, to check out our website, come back for our programs, and in closing, from my point of view, no label and no slogan, and no party and no skin color, and indeed no religion is more important than the human being. James Baldwin. Thank you for coming.